Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Let's Talk Alcohol, presented by Dr. Peter Butt. For your information, all participants' microphones are muted today. If you have any questions that you would like addressed after the presentation, please use the Q&A box that is located in the bottom center of your Zoom Windows taskbar. The chat box is also available if you have any comments or technical support questions during the presentation. My name is Laura. I'm the FASD Research Coordinator with the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute. The Saskatchewan Prevention Institute is a provincial organization that provides services to all those living on Treaty Lands 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10, and the traditional lands of the Métis. We are committed to working towards reconciliation and strive to reaffirm our relationship with one another. Our organizational focus is to help all children thrive through primary prevention and the promotion of well-being. We believe that all children, regardless of ability, have the right to the best physical, social, and emotional health possible. We provide education, training, and capacity building across 6 main program pillars: early childhood mental health, perinatal and infant health, sexual and reproductive health, prevention of child abuse and neglect, prevention of child injury, and prevention of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or FASD. A main focus of the FASD prevention program is to provide evidence-based accessible information on topics related to alcohol use and FASD prevention to service providers and communities. As you may know, Canada's new guidance on alcohol and health has been released this year, and it provides people living in Canada with the information they need to make informed decisions about their alcohol consumption. Here to speak on this topic today is Dr. Peter Butt, who's a Certificant and Fellow with the College of Family Physicians of Canada with Special Competency in Addiction Medicine. He's a clinical associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan and served as a consultant in addiction medicine in the Saskatchewan Health Authority for 24 years. In addition to teaching and other research, he chaired the original development of Canada's low-risk drinking guidelines in 2011, co-chaired the Canadian Guidelines on Alcohol Use Disorder among older adults in 2019, and co-chaired the 2023 Canadian Guidance on Alcohol and Health with the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction. Dr. Peter Butt, we are truly fortunate to have you with us today, so thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, and for your kind introduction. Volume is good, is it?
Yes, it's perfect. Thank you.
And the screen is fine. Well, that's wonderful. And thank you for the participants for taking the time. I believe this, because it's being recorded, this presentation will be archived and available if you want to repeat it at some time. Now, in terms of disclosures of affiliations and interests, everyone that was involved in this project, all 23 experts, including the 2 co-chairs, myself and Dr. Catherine Paradis from CCSA, representing 16 different organizations with the particular interest in alcohol-related research from coast to coast, had to go through the Guidelines International Network process for disclosure of interests and management of conflicts. This had oversight by the Public Health Agency of Canada. So it was a rigorous process, and any declarations and necessary mitigations are addressed on the CCSA website if you're interested in those details. But here you can see quite a range of researchers that were involved with this. With regards to myself, I have no industry sponsorship or other conflicts. I'm contracted to the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan, as well as to the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction. This is project-based contracting, and I also have a contract with the Public Health Agency of Canada. With regards more specifically to this project, it was funded by a Health Canada grant with project management by CCSA. So what I want to do is to help you understand the methodology and evidence behind the changes to Canada's previous low-risk drinking guidelines, which provided the foundation for our current guidance on alcohol and health. I'd hope that you'd learn how alcohol use contributes to health risk for various diseases, including cancer and heart disease. And I also want to outline the clinical implications of the guidance, including opportunities during various patient interactions for discussing alcohol consumption and related health risks. This is intended to destigmatize those conversations, so it's easier for healthcare providers to engage in them. Now, we knew as the years went by following the release of the 2011 low-risk drinking guidelines that we were becoming more and more dated. There were significant developments in knowledge about alcohol-related mortality and morbidity, significant discussions with regards to how one should identify this in terms of comparison groups and so on. There was evolving research on alcohol and social harms, which was coming to the fore, and also other countries, specifically UK, France, Australia, had also updated their LRDGs, and they had come in at a lower level than what we had proposed in 2011. So we felt that it was important to update and help people make informed decisions about alcohol use. So how did we go about this? This is internationally, the approach to establishing low-risk alcohol drinking guidelines is based on predominantly mathematical modeling. So we really had three key questions. What are the long-term risks and benefits? And we had to open ourselves to the possibility of benefits as well, specifically from the J curve, which has been there historically. But what about the long-term consequences of consumption? What about the short-term or more immediate impacts of consumption? And what about the risks for women who are pregnant or breastfeeding? Very simple, very straightforward. However, the evidence we had to gather in 2 years was significant. Fortunately, we were able to go through a great development process working off of what Australia had done in their search on the impacts of alcohol use that covered the literature from 2000 to 2017. They did a very rigorous process. It was posted, which is required by law in Australia. So the information was readily accessible. From 2017 to 2021, the team also identified almost 6,000 systematic reviews that were retrieved. We used agree-to tools, AmStar2, GRADE, as the typical tools used to evaluate the evidence in each of these systematic reviews. 239 of them were screened for full text eligibility. They met inclusion criteria. However, what we ended up focusing in on were 16 systematic reviews of the highest quality evidence. And these reviews reflected 363 studies, 10 million participants, and 500,000 case reports. What we were looking at was that dose-response relationship or relative risk on 20 World Health Organization causally related conditions and injuries. So there's over 230 ICD-coded conditions that are causally related to alcohol. However, that you can then cluster them down to different organ systems and so on in order to condense the data gathering. What we wanted was also not only the relative risk in terms of this dose response, but also modeling for the absolute risk thresholds for 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 100. And I'll explain that very shortly. So that was the methodological process. The other thing that was important is that we were using, as a comparison, lifetime abstainers. Now, in the past, frequently with lowest drinking guidelines, people use current abstainers. The problem with current abstainers, however, is that includes a group of people that are termed perhaps a bit colloquially sick quitters. These are people that have been forced to quit drinking alcohol because of ill health. So it doesn't really capture and that may be ill health completely unrelated to their alcohol use. So current abstainers doesn't really give you a clear comparison group when we want to look at dose response. So what we chose were lifetime abstainers. These are people that have never drank alcohol. And what we want is to use them as a comparison to exposure of alcohol to the general population in increasing doses. So we could say, well, what's the impact of increasing doses on people compared to people who have never drank? Seemed to be a pretty rational comparison. The other thing that we used was, in terms of impact, was years of life lost. And this turned out to be about 17.5 years of life lost per 1,000 people. This covers both morbidity and mortality and captures the full impact of alcohol use in terms of outcome. So we ran the relative risk curve. This is an indication of it. It goes up exponentially in terms of the various steps. And then for absolute risk, we wanted to look at 1 in 1,000, 1 in 100. Now, 1 in a million is the level of risk most people will tolerate for involuntary exposure to air or water, for example. 1 in 1,000 is the risk level, and this would be one death in 1,000. This would be the risk level most people accept in terms of the international standard in epidemiology for voluntary exposure. So risk taking, riding a bike, swimming, this sort of thing. And at that level, it's comparable to the risk of death by drowning in Canada. 1 in 100 is 10 times greater risk compared to voluntary activity. But that's the level of risk that has typically been used internationally to define low risk drinking. Now, that's not because of health reasons. It's not transparent. It's simply because of our attachment to alcohol. That's the level that was done for cultural, social, political, and economic reasons. So what we felt is that it was really important that people be able to compare the impacts of alcohol on their health with other voluntary activities. A comparison for that one death in 100 is the risk of dying in a motor vehicle crash. Now, you can argue that there's a greater imperative to drive in our country in order to access goods or to go to work, to travel generally. It's not really a purely voluntary activity. It's something that we really must do in many instances. So it's really not something that you could equate to whether or not one drinks alcohol. That's purely a voluntary activity. So we wanted those cut levels. And what we found is that 1 in 1,000 was equivalent to 2 standard drinks per week. We knew it was going to be low, but we didn't realize it would be that low. And 1 in 100 would be 6 standard drinks per week, which was actually close to what the Australians got, keeping in mind that a standard drink in the UK, Australia, and elsewhere, particularly in Europe, is 10 grams of ethanol. Canada uses 13.45 grams of ethanol. So you have to make an adjustment when you compare international findings. So on Canadian standard drinks, what the Australians had come up with low risk drinking was 7. We came up with 6 at this level. We also looked at the impact in terms of males and females. So in this instance, at the lower levels, up to 100, 1 in 100 or 6 standard drinks per week, there really was no significant difference in the impact on males and females. However, once you get above 6 standard drinks per week, that 7+ range, what you see is a markedly increased risk of cumulative health problems for women because of difference in physiology. They have decreased alcohol dehydrogenase, they have decreased lean body mass. So if you compare the blood alcohol concentration drink for drink between women and men, it's going to go up higher and stay longer for women compared to men for the same volume. So this is an important distinction that comes into play as you get into higher levels of consumption. Now, there's things that people were interested in with regards to this update that couldn't be addressed through mathematical modeling. And that had to do with alcohol in women, per occasion drinking, alcohol and violence and aggression, and alcohol and mental health. So we commissioned reports to address these various issues. We also had focus groups when we started out to find out what Canadians wanted from us in this exercise. And they very clearly told us, don't tell us what to do. Don't give us strict rules or be patronizing. Just give us the facts. The facts need to be simple, short, clear. They need to be something that people can act upon if they choose. They also wanted to know why we have guidelines. Why is it important? What's the reason for their existence? So we kept that in mind as we formulated the responses. And the recommendations led us to given those focus groups, led us to change the document from low risk alcohol drinking guidelines to Canada's guidance on alcohol and health. We wanted to take a whole health perspective. We felt that was most transparent for the Canadian population to understand the impact of alcohol on their health and well-being so that they can make better informed decisions for themselves. The primary recommendation, and this is very Canadian, it's probably not what you heard in the media, is that it's recommended for people living in Canada to consider reducing their alcohol use. That's it. People should consider reducing their alcohol use because less is better. It was a very simple recommendation, in part because we want to reach out to all people who consume beverage alcohol, not just those that think that they're within hitting range of a particular target. But as you'll see, even a moderate reduction in alcohol use can improve one's health and decrease the risk of harm. In order to help people understand this, we came up with the continuum of risk. And this is what you probably saw reported in the media. We know that there's absolutely no safe level of alcohol use. Risk increases with the amount consumed. However, 1 to 2 standard drinks that take you up to that 1 in 1,000 threshold of risk is what we consider to be low risk in our continuum. The 3 to 6 standard drinks per week we termed a moderate risk level, because in here you're beginning to see some gradual increase in the risk, particularly of cancer. And there are 7 different types of cancer that are causally associated with alcohol. So even at this level, and we knew with the 2011 guidelines, based upon new evidence, that people drinking within them were coming to harm, which was why there was an imperative. I'm sorry, there seems to be a flicker on my personal video. I'll stop that and continue on with the shared screen. We knew that people were coming to harm in the 2011 recommendations with new evidence that emerged, and that was the imperative to make change. And then as you get into 7 standard drinks per week plus, and that's just a standard drink per day, which for a lot of people is a pretty low level of consumption. Now you're beginning to see an increasing risk of heart disease or stroke. And this is where it starts to increase more exponentially, it rises steeper. But the good news is that with this continuum of risk, if people decrease, they're going to decrease their level of risk and harm. And arguably, people that are in a much higher increasingly risk zone are going to appreciate a greater degree of improvement in health and well-being by dropping down by, let's say, 2 standard drinks per week than somebody, let's say, 16 to 14 per week, as opposed to someone going from 6 to 4. So people that are drinking relatively heavily are actually the ones that are going to be able to benefit the most by any sort of reduction. Absolutely essential to this is an understanding of what's a standard drink. And in this case, it's, as I mentioned, 13.45 grams. That was based upon a standard bottle of beer back in the day. You may even remember the stubby bottles, or I may be dating myself. At any rate, a standard bottle of beer, a can of beer, cider, or cooler at 5% alcohol content. So that would be a standard drink, as would 5 ounces of 12% wine. The challenge with wine is that it might be 12%, it might be 14% alcohol by volume. So it's a little more challenging unless there's labeling at the point of pour for people to know, are there 5 standard drinks in this bottle of wine? Are there 6? How many are we contending with here? And similarly, with distilled alcohol or spirits, it's 1.5 ounces of 40% alcohol by content. This is a difficult thing for people to translate during a drinking episode. It's hard for them to look at a container and figure out how many are in there unless it's very standardized. So this is why labeling at the point of pour is so important. With regards to per occasion drinking, and this evidence came from a commissioned review of the literature, what was found that more than two drinks in one occasion is associated with an increased risk of harm to self and others, including injuries and violence. So this is the acute harms. To avoid the chronic harms, the cumulative harms, we have this continuum of risk. To avoid the acute harms, we have this recommendation about no more than two standard drinks in one occasion. And then with regards to reproductive health, there was really no change whatsoever in the recommendation. When pregnant or trying to get pregnant or whilst breastfeeding, it's best not to drink. Very simple, very straightforward. With regards to the commission reports, I mentioned the per occasion use, but also we had a systematic review of the effect of alcohol consumption on the development of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. People were interested in alcohol and mental health. We also commissioned a report specifically with regards for women vis-a-vis low-risk drinking guidelines. And then this was broadened out to include males as well with a broader gender lens. We also wanted to look at reviews on the association between alcohol use, aggression, and violence. And this was also done. Now, with regards to the result, the challenge with alcohol and mental health is that there's very poor evidence out there. And in this particular case, the absence of evidence doesn't mean the absence of presence or evidence of absence, if you will. We know that there's this bidirectional relationship between alcohol and mental health, but we just couldn't find adequate studies to include that would help to delineate what that was. And in the second paragraph, I mentioned a number of things that challenge the methodology. So it really needs some good, well-designed studies. And this bidirectional nature of alcohol, or relationship, if you will, between alcohol and mental health is essentially, sometimes we know that people that are struggling with mental health problems, depression, anxiety, and so on, drink alcohol as a form of self-medication, which may just make it worse. On the other hand, people who drink alcohol may have higher levels of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. So what is this relationship? How do we tease it out in terms of cause, effect, dose effect of alcohol, and so on with regards to people drinking and then developing a mental health problem, or people with a mental health problem drinking, and what impact does that have on their condition? So basically, this is an area that requires further study. With regards to sex and gender, as I mentioned, in that increasingly high risk zone above the upper limit of the moderate risk zone at 7+ standard drinks per week, the health risks increase more steeply for women than for men. However, we see men also experience these cumulative health risks, but what we also see with men is more accidents, injuries, violence, and death resulting from the per occasion drinking or acute intoxication. So this suggests that we need gendered messaging in order to help to communicate these health risks to the Canadian population. More specifically, with regards to alcohol use, violence, and aggression, the commission review that came from the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto found that there was problems associated with acute intoxication, heavy use, and a history of alcohol problems, specifically with regards to male-perpetrated general violence, male-perpetrated sexual violence, and male-perpetrated intimate partner violence. So this reinforced that gender lens and the importance of gender messaging with regards to males and alcohol. What we also found is that associated victim drinking was increased risk. But it was really, really important in the communication of this that victim drinking does not make them responsible for the perpetration of violence. It put them in a riskier place, but it does not make them responsible for the violence. So in unpacking this in terms of the sex and gender approach with regards to men and alcohol, it's both sex and gender. Sex in terms of that combination of that combination of alcohol and testosterone, and gender in terms of alcohol disinhibition and the emergence of patterns of behavior that are typically considered to reflect toxic masculinity. So this is really important when we think about communication to the public. Okay, now going forward, we really felt that it was important that we landed on some pretty basic principles. And one, of course, is less is better. Less consumption means less risk of harm from alcohol. The other is that people have a right to know, and how they put into play this knowledge in terms of how much they drink is up to them, quite frankly. But there are things that we can do through a harm reduction intervention. So it's important that people understand that alcohol is a group 1 carcinogen, that alcohol, in fact, is not cardioprotective, but it is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And in terms of the acute harms, it's certainly a problem with regards to accidents and violence and injuries. This has implications, however, for public policy. And what we've seen during the pandemic is a rolling back of some of the controls that we had before with regards to access and availability of beverage alcohol. But at the very least, people need to be informed. There's over 40 jurisdictions or countries across the world that have some form of mandatory labeling that's required. Standard drink labeling, which I mentioned, which is important for people to understand how much alcohol they're drinking at the point of pour. They can't manage what they can't measure. This needs to be enabled. Health warnings, it's just really basic that a company that's selling a group 1 carcinogen intended to be ingested has a health warning on it with regards to the potential impact, and also potentially guidance on alcohol and health labeling. So again, consumers have that right to know. So what are the implications in terms of clinical implementation and knowledge mobilization? Well, there's different ways of disseminating this information, such as webinars like this. There's exchangers and expert advice and podcasts and so on that could be done, panel discussions, training and tools that may be made available, and collaborative efforts. And certainly the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction is very much committed to collaborative efforts to help refine and improve the message to different populations, different communities across the country. As long as the basic information, the scientific information is accurate, the delivery of that has a great deal of flexibility attached to it. We also need to be thinking about the context of alcohol consumption in Canada. And amongst all Canadians, there's about 22% on average of people who abstain. Almost another 22%, which by self-report are at less than 3 standard drinks per week, that 1 to 2. There's another 17% in that 3 to 6 or moderate risk zone. So if you include the abstainers, 60% of the Canadian population are in that moderate or lower level, which leaves 40% of the Canadian population who consume 80% of the alcohol in that 7+ standard drink per week group. If we remove the abstainers and just look at drinkers, then less than 3 is 27 to 28%, 3 to 6, 21 to 22%. So low plus moderate range drinkers, drinking population are already within that low to moderate zone. So that needs to be reinforced. What we need to do is to target increasingly that 7+ group, which is we have 51% of those who drink. And of course, these are the folks that aren't going to relate to a message that you should only drink 2 standard drinks per week. That's not helpful. That's not a starting place. So we need to be able to individualize risk to help people to understand or contextualize, well, how much are they drinking and what risk of potential harm does this pose to them as an individual? Because I've presented you population health data in terms of these risk curves and so on. Now we want to drill into the individual. So they have to look then or reflect on their family history of alcohol use and potential health problems, in addition to their personal health history. So personal and family history helps to build up a more evidence-based individual risk profile. And we can use tools such as these. This is increasing risk for female grams of alcohol intake per day. 13.45 lands in here between 10 and 15. So just a standard drink per day. And you can see that in terms of heart disease in general, there is a neutral effect that 5 to 8% reduction in ischemic heart disease and ischemic stroke isn't within the confidence intervals. At best, we could say it's neutral as opposed to definitively protective. But that also has to be put in the context of these other heart conditions that evolve in terms of high blood pressure, atrial fibrillation and flutter, and subarachnoid bleeds or intracerebral bleeds. So as a system, the cardiovascular system is negatively impacted by beverage alcohol. When we consume alcohol, we can't say this drink is only going to my coronary arteries. It's not going to affect any other system in my body. It's ludicrous. It's going to go through the bloodstream and affect absolutely every part of the body. So we need to have a whole health view on this and look at some of these impacts on different systems. So if you have a history of hypertension, you're on medication, you might want to reduce or perhaps stop drinking alcohol as a way of mitigating that effect, for example. What we also see here is a significant impact in terms of women in regular alcohol consumption with regards to liver cirrhosis. This goes up quite dramatically with the increasing amounts consumed. And we get into the risk of breast cancer. Again, here's your cut point of 1 standard drink per day, leading up to statistically significant levels for breast cancer, for colorectal cancer, liver cancer at a slightly higher level of consumption, at lower levels of consumption, esophageal cancer, cancer of the oral, the mouth and pharynx, throat, and laryngeal cancer. So these are all significant impacts at relatively low levels of consumption. For men, it's somewhat similar, but vascular effects and the liver effects aren't perhaps quite so profound as they are with women, but nevertheless, they're present. Cancer effects are more pronounced. And certainly we see this with regards to the GI cancers in particular. I think it's important for people to appreciate what a group 1 carcinogen is in terms of a criteria for cancer causation. There has to be proved at a cellular level that alcohol plus the cell type results in cancer cells being formed. So you need a cellular impact that demonstrates that mechanism in the lab. You then need to reproduce that using animal models, typically rats, and you can give them alcohol and see if they develop breast cancer, for example. And then we need to look at epidemiological data that establish this association in the human population. All 3 criteria have to be met for a group 1 carcinogen. Alcohol does. This is the percentage on the right of the cancers that are formed in these different types of cancer due to alcohol use. So it's very high when you think of drinking alcohol and the inflammation in the mouth, the throat, the esophagus, what you're breathing into the larynx, going through the stomach and the colon, going through the blood to the liver and to the breast. It makes sense that it's at a higher level where it's closer to causing inflammation and cellular damage higher up in the GI tract. So roughly a third of those cancers are caused by alcohol. However, they're relatively rare cancers. And when you consider the number of people impacted because breast and colorectal cancer it affects so many more people than the upper GI cancers. More people are impacted because of the effect of alcohol and breast cancer and alcohol and colorectal cancer. So again, important information that consumers deserve to know. Now, many of you might be surprised with regards to the shift between what we were taught before about alcohol being good for your heart and the evidence that's now presented. And the World Heart Federation came out with a policy brief for 2021 that was very clear, and it said, contrary to popular opinion, alcohol is not good for the heart. So risk due to alcohol consumption increase for all major cardiovascular disease, including hypertensive heart disease, cardiomyopathy, atrial fibrillation, flutter, and stroke. So a neutral impact in terms of coronary artery disease, although it's quite prevalent, is outweighed by these other cardiovascular conditions that are exacerbated by alcohol. So they took a very much a whole heart approach, a whole cardiovascular approach in their assessment. And this is contrary to what has been preached by cardiologists historically. So this requires a further reset in terms of the knowledge mobilization, both in clinical settings and in general to the Canadian public. Alcohol use disorder, of course, is a concern. This is this guidance on alcohol and health is not intended as treatment for an alcohol use disorder. At best, it would lead to primary or potentially secondary prevention of an alcohol use disorder. If people are drinking less, they're less likely to run into problems with one. But certainly providing people with information to prevent it is important. Screening, and this is a shift in this slide from screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment to a SIPR with R to the power of 3, which is a model that tries to engage primary healthcare provider in a more robust interaction with people that are drinking. So there needs to be screening, there needs to be intervention, which is really a series of conversations, of brief intervention. Pharmacotherapy in terms of anti-craving medication should be prescribed if a person meets criteria for a moderate to severe alcohol use disorder. People do indeed need to be referred for counseling and other community resources, but they need to be assessed. And as they transition into early remission, sustained remission, they deserve to receive recovery support. So the ability for primary healthcare providers to lean into this in the form of chronic disease management, if you will, has great potential, but they need the tools and they need the knowledge. Overall, when people are interacting, less is better is absolutely the right message, with any reduction to be reinforced. So how do we help people achieve that? Well, there's a triaged approach to goal setting that's implicit here. We want to provoke reflection in terms of alcohol and health. In general, we want people to reduce. If they're drinking in the high-risk zone, 7+ standard drinks per week, we want them to reduce to the moderate risk zone or less. So that would be 6 or less per week. That would be a good intervention. If they have increased personal risk of alcohol attributable condition, it's not there, but they have, let's say, a family history, then it would be a good idea for them to reduce to 1 to 2 standard drinks per week or less, depending upon their perception of that risk. If they have the presence of an alcohol attributable condition, they should consider 0 because it may be making that condition worse. And a trial of not drinking might help to ameliorate or mitigate that particular health problem. But in negotiating this with people, this is a broad goal-setting approach. And approaching this with people, we have to keep in mind that individual risk comfort is variable and not necessarily grounded in personal risk. For example, a person that has a family history of cancer may be more inclined to go to 0 than somebody who has who actually has high blood pressure and is on medication. They might think, well, I'm really not inclined to reduce the amount that I drink. I'm on high blood pressure pills, and I'm okay with that as a trade-off. So, you know, this is going to vary from person to person. People working with individuals on the front line are very familiar with the trans-theoretical model of change, the stages of change, motivational interview. And so we have to start where people are at. And that implies drilling into further why people are drinking. And this helps to individualize the approach to address the motivating factors. They're broken down between personal effect motives and social effect motives. For many people, it's a combination of the two. But the predominant ones for personal effect motivation is for enjoyment, to alter mood. People use mood altering substances to change the way they feel, to avoid boredom, to escape them, to get drunk. Sometimes people are quite deliberate and open about that's why they drink. They drink to get drunk, and why would you ever consider something other than that? Particularly, unfortunately, in the youth population. The social effect motivators tend to cluster around socializing, to celebrate special events. And certainly with regards to beverage alcohol, it marks transitions from the end of a workday to perhaps the evening or the post-work time, to the end of the work week, to the weekend. Would be another example, to celebrate special events like birth, marriages, death, whatever the case may be, to increase power, and think of power lunches, think of shot competition between drinkers, and also as a form of social ritual, which is heavily embedded in some cultures. This is what we do. This is part of our identity, and decreasing it is seen as an attack on that identity. So we have to be able to present to people the benefits of alcohol reduction. It's not about taking away something that may be important to them or that has a valuable role in their life, but helping them to think about it in a whole health and wellness context. Because if they decrease alcohol, they're going to decrease calories and have weight loss. It's going to improve their sleep and give them more energy. It's going to improve cognition and memory. It's going to improve mood. We also know that physiologically, it's going to decrease blood pressure, decrease blood sugar, decrease triglycerides, decrease liver fat. Liver fat is great for a goose that's going to become pate, but we don't need to be that gorged goose. So decreasing liver fat is important. Improving sex life. It may seem from the media that alcohol improves sex life with disinhibition, but in fact, it has the opposite effect, particularly with erectile dysfunction, but also with the complications of impaired communication, perhaps lack of consent, and so on. Improved immune function. Didn't have it in the slide. Tuberculosis can be partially attributable to alcohol use. If it's endemic in the area, in the community, then the decreased immune function with higher levels of alcohol use places people at greater risk of contracting tuberculosis. There's decreased cancer risk for those 7 cancers that we covered. Decreased risk of accidents and injuries, improved relationships, improved communication, less aggression and violence, and financial savings. So there's a host of things that we can present to people, induce them to decrease their alcohol use. This isn't about abstinence. This is simply about improving their health and well-being. And some of these things might appeal to people to help balance the sense that they're being ripped off somehow by this type of messaging. So harm reduction strategies that could be promoted and employed is, again, number one, keeping track of how many drinks you have per week. This is no different than with tobacco cessation. You need to start with a number and set a target, establish a limit. So you decide on a weekly drinking target and stick to it. If you can't stick to your limit, then perhaps there's more loss of control here than the person has reported or perhaps appreciates. And their relationship with beverage alcohol has shifted over to one that's more akin to an alcohol use disorder, where there's loss of control, compulsive use, and continued use despite negative consequences. To slow down the absorption of the alcohol, it's best to eat before drinking and whilst one drinks. People should choose drinks with a lower percentage of alcohol. If it's just 2 standard drinks on an occasion, if those were 0.4 standard drink beverages, 0.5 standard drink beverages, you could drink 4 of those rather than 2 full standard drinks, just as an example. People should drink slowly in small sips, again, to slow the absorption. They should always have water on hand and alternate an alcoholic beverage with a non-alcoholic one. And the more water, the better hydrated people are, and the less likely they are to have a hangover the next day. So people should also explore alcohol-free products. And the industry is leaning into this as much as they whinge about labeling and other things. There's absolutely no problem because of product placement with some alcohol, particularly beer companies, having alcohol-free beer with nutritional labeling in grocery stores. Similarly, in the hospitality industry, there's a lot more alcohol-free cocktails, if you will, and other beverages that are coming out through the craft brewery industry that are alcohol-free. So people are realizing that this is a demographic, and it's a shift in thinking from selling higher volumes of alcohol to selling more product. Because if you can sell more 0.5 standard drink beverages at just a moderately reduced price, you may exceed what you're going to earn if you're simply pushing the alcohol, because at some point people have to stop. Now, CCSA has a communications toolkit that might be of interest to people with different printable key message posters, different social media assets, different key message presentation, depending on what you think would resonate with the population you're working with. They're working on other campaigns. There's a website link there. And what you can see on the right-hand side is a poster that reinforces that drinking less is better, the continuum of risk, and to encourage people to reduce it, information on standard drinks, to increase alcohol literacy, encouraging people to drink less, setting a target, and harm reduction strategies to help people put that into play. So there's information out there that might be helpful that you might want to adapt or adopt according to the population you're serving. CCSA also has a workbook, Knowing Your Limits with Alcohol, a practical guide to assessing your drinking. This is really to help people with an alcohol use disorder to reduce the amount that they drink, and can be used in conjunction with pharmacotherapy, but you could use it simply for people that are drinking at higher levels and finding it a bit challenging to come down, that don't meet the criteria for an alcohol use disorder. It's really like CBT, workbook based. They go through a series of exercises. It helps to get them engaged, and you follow up with them periodically to see how the process is going. So with that, I'm going to end my presentation and open it up so we have plenty of time for discussion. I want to thank you for your attendance and participation. I don't see any questions in the chat, so feel free to unmute. Laura's going to moderate this, and I'd be happy to engage in further conversation directly. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this presentation and for sharing your knowledge today. I found the presentation really insightful, especially the part where you talked about the lifetime risk of alcohol attributable years of life lost by sex and how it was computed. It really helped me better understand the continuum and like how it was created. So that will help us guide communications around the continuum as well. And I'm excited to hear that the CCSA is working on the microsite with information about this to the public. This would certainly be very helpful for a lot of people. We do have some time for questions, so please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box and I can read them out.
Yeah, with regards to the knowledge mobilization, CCSA has worked with different organizations, breast cancer, liver society, and that sort of thing. There have been presentations to them, and they're taking this information. Of course, if they're representing a group that's particularly interested in liver health, they're going to focus in more on the liver impacts. However, they're going to put it into a broader context and use the same sort of harm reduction approach as part of their counseling process. So no different with breast cancer or other organizations. The sex and gender messaging, I think, is really, really important, and that has to be nuanced so it's appropriate, particularly with males and the propensity for violence and aggression. This needs to be addressed, and for females in terms of increased vulnerability that you referenced at higher levels of consumption. So, I think that this had this garnered a lot of attention in the media, as people are probably aware, and because they focused in on that 2 standard drinks per week. We very much, however, want to focus on that continuum of risk to provoke or prompt reflection so that people can choose what their goal is given the continuum, and hopefully reduce. Any reduction is a benefit. Expecting everyone to go to 2 standard drinks per week is a non-starter. That wasn't a recommendation, because we knew this isn't what people wanted. This wasn't going to be helpful. We needed to present something that helped people to situate their own use and make their own decisions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the harm reduction lens is really very helpful and can really help people to actually reconsider their alcohol use.
Yeah, it's interesting because all too often the way people learn how to drink is by negative consequences. They drink, they embarrass themselves, they get sick, they get into a compromised situation. Unfortunately, some of these can be quite traumatic and even deadly. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can provide people with information, say, starting out, keep it down at this lower level. It's not a race to inebriation.
I do find that communicating this message might particularly be challenging for people who work with youth. So do you have any recommendations for that?
Yes, I think that there are several things that are important. And of course, one is denormalizing how much youth actually drink, because when you go into certain environments, well, they say everyone drinks and everyone gets drunk. Well, no, that's not the case. A minority of youth get drunk. There might be a significant number that drink, but it's not the way that it's talked up in different circles. And so denormalization is one thing. Helping people to socialize, helping youth to socialize, and often there's a lot of anxiety around socialization in that age group, is important. And certainly in terms of the interventions done by the government of Iceland, what we see there is a whole range of interventions to increase and this was because of the high levels of alcohol consumption amongst youth in Iceland and negative consequences. What they found is by increasing other activities that were available to them through schools, through extracurricular activities, whether it's within the arts and culture or sports, not just competitive sports, but recreation league sports where there's skill development, social interaction, and ability to get together. It's not necessarily school dominated. It might involve different groups. Hiking, trekking, it's a beautiful country to travel in, apparently. These are the sorts of things that are very pro-social, engage youth, use their immense amount of energy and enthusiasm when it can be channeled in a constructive way. So they're not left to boredom and their own means to get through a day or a week. So I think that being very active on the preventive side is important in terms of offering alternatives, because when people want to socialize, it's really the company, it's not the chemical that counts. So, thinking that you can only socialize whilst drinking or using cannabis or whatever the case may be is highly problematic in developing those social skills and indeed other skills. These are growing brains, they're developing brains. They should be able to have fun and be exposed to new things in a way that's not threatening, that's supportive, and is less likely to bring them to harm. My apology for my video link there. It periodically has a seizure, and I've been working with IT on this and haven't quite fixed it, as you can see.
Don't worry about it. Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and I'll be looking up Iceland and like what they did for reducing alcohol use among youth, because I think inspiring from like different multi-pronged approaches can really help us in our work as well.
Right, right.
Hey, it doesn't seem like we have any questions.
Mm-hmm.
So
one thing that I can share, if people might be interested and a bit shy to ask, is the impact that this has so far. And Leger has done polls early on and subsequent to the release. And basically, it seems to be settling out into about a third, a third, a third. A third of people have said, you know, they're definitely reducing the amount that they're drinking. A third are contemplating a reduction, and a third are not interested. They don't care for the messaging. And of course, you know, people that are more committed to their beverage alcohol are less likely to want to reduce. But if over time, with a cultural shift and more information and social marketing and so on, people get this information, they can say, well, you know, I can go out and socialize and still drink, but maybe cut how much I drink in half by alternating beverages. That's a win-win. So it's, again, simply a way of encouraging people to try a reduction. And the sober Februaries, the sober curious movement, there are other things going on that help to support this, where people share the benefits. That benefit slide, I think, is an important one to communicate, because it's, again, we want to get away from a negative approach to something that's more positive. Here are the benefits. This is what you can experience. Give it a try.